My wife always had a thing for change. She couldn't stand routine. After meeting up with her friend the other day, she came home with a wild idea: getting a horse. Yeah, you heard that right, a whole damn horse. She said her friend, the one with the big house and the money, had a stable, and it made her think maybe we could do the same. I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. We already had 2 dogs, 3 cats, and, oh yeah, 2 kids. Adding a horse into the mix seemed like a complete headache. I asked her straight out, where exactly are you planning on keeping this horse? I knew she loved animals, but there's a line, and I thought we had drawn it long ago. Our backyard was big enough for the kids and the dogs, but a horse. I wasn't sure what she was imagining, but I knew the logistics alone would be a nightmare. I told her, calmly but directly, that it wasn't going to happen. We had enough on our plate without adding a barnyard animal to it. She wasn't happy about my reaction, of course. She started talking about how a horse could be a great addition to the family, how it could be an experience for the kids. I could see her eyes light up at the idea, and for a second, I almost felt guilty. But then I reminded myself about the vet bills, the feed, the upkeep, not to mention the space. This wasn't some kind of fairy tale, it was real life. And in real life, you can't just go around adding animals like you're building a zoo. The thing is, her friend had a way of getting into her head. Every time they hung out, my wife would come back with some grand new idea that never seemed reasonable. Last year, it was a yoga studio in the basement. Before that, it was chickens. This time, it was a horse. I've always been the one to keep things grounded, and sometimes I think she resented me for it. But someone had to be practical, someone had to think about how all this would actually work. I told her as much, and she didn't take it well. She said I was always shooting down her dreams, that I never wanted anything to change. That wasn't it, though. I wasn't against change, I was against chaos. And to me, getting a horse was exactly that, chaos. I asked her if she had even thought about what it would take to take care of a horse. She shrugged it off, saying we could make it work if we really wanted to. I hated that phrase, if we really wanted to. It made it sound like I was the one lacking the will to make her dreams come true. It led to a bit of a fight, not the first one we've had about her ideas. I told her that maybe her friend's lifestyle wasn't the best thing for us to be imitating. That didn't sit well with her. She accused me of not liking her friend, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. I didn't like her friend, but it wasn't personal. It was just that every time my wife came back from a visit, there was always some new, impractical plan that I had to put my foot down on. By the end of it, we were both pretty frustrated. She stormed off to cool down, and I stayed in the kitchen, trying to figure out how we always ended up in this position. I didn't want to be the bad guy. I didn't want to be the one always saying no. But I also couldn't just let her run with every wild idea that came her way. We had responsibilities, we had kids to think about. And as much as I wanted her to be happy, I had to be realistic about what we could handle. That night, things were tense. We barely spoke to each other. I knew she was still mad, but I figured it was better to let her cool off before we talked about it again. I wasn't going to budge on this, though. A horse was too much, and I wasn't about to get caught up in another one of her friend's fantasies. Eventually, we'd have to find some kind of middle ground, but for now, I was standing firm. No horse, no matter how much she wanted one. My wife's friend has always been a point of tension between us. Every time she spends time with that woman, she comes back with some new plan or idea that just doesn't fit with our life. Her friend lives in a world that seems completely disconnected from reality. She's got a big backyard, complete with a pony for her kids. And every time my wife comes home from a visit, she's got a head full of thoughts about how we could do something similar. It's like her friend lights a fire under her, and I have to be the one to put it out every single time. To be honest, I never liked her friend. It wasn't that I had anything personal against her, but the ideas she put into my wife's head were always way out of line. She wasn't a bad person, but she lived in a bubble, and I didn't appreciate her trying to drag my wife into that bubble with her. It was always something impractical, a horse, a yoga studio, some new pet, like she thought we could just throw caution to the wind and dive into whatever fanciful thing struck her that week. I couldn't understand how my wife was so easily swayed by it all. I finally decided I had to say something about it. It wasn't easy, but I couldn't keep biting my tongue every time her friend planted some new idea in her head. I told my wife flat out that I thought her friend was a bad influence on her. I said that the ideas she brought home were unrealistic and not suited to our lives. I tried to be straightforward about it, but there was no way to avoid it sounding critical. My wife took it exactly how I feared she would. She said I was trying to control her, trying to stifle her creativity. She got defensive, and I could see the hurt in her eyes. We ended up in a heated argument. She accused me of never supporting her dreams, of always being the one to say no to everything she wanted. She said that I was the one keeping us stuck in the same place, never willing to do anything new or exciting. It was frustrating because that wasn't how I saw it at all. To me, I was just trying to keep us from getting in over our heads. I wasn't against change or trying new things, but there had to be a limit, and her friend's influence kept pushing those limits to the point of absurdity. I tried to explain my side of it. I told her that I wasn't against her having dreams or wanting to do something different, but that we had to be realistic about what we could handle. I reminded her about our responsibilities, the kids, the pets, the house. We couldn't just dive into something like getting a horse or a pony just because her friend made it sound like a good idea. But no matter how I tried to phrase it, it all came out wrong. It sounded like I was shutting her down, and I could tell it was only making things worse. She ended up storming out of the room, saying she needed space to think. I let her go, knowing that pushing the issue right then would just make it worse. I stood there for a while, trying to collect my thoughts. It felt like I was always the one who had to bring her back down to earth, and I hated it. I didn't want to be the one always saying no, but I also couldn't just let her get carried away with every idea her friend put in her head. That evening, we barely spoke. The tension in the house was thick, and I knew it wasn't going to just go away on its own. My wife was hurt, and I couldn't blame her. I knew that she saw me as the one standing in the way of her dreams, and that wasn't how I wanted things to be. But at the same time, I couldn't just give in and let her friend dictate our lives. There had to be a line somewhere, and I felt like I was the only one trying to draw it. I spent the rest of the night thinking about how we could move forward. I knew I had to find a way to talk to her without it turning into another fight. I didn't want to be the villain in her story, but I also couldn't just ignore what I saw happening. Her friend was filling her head with ideas that didn't make sense for our family, and I had to find a way to make her understand that without making her feel like I was against her. It was a fine line to walk, and I wasn't sure how to do it. The next morning, things were still tense. My wife avoided me, and I gave her the space she seemed to need. I knew we couldn't keep going like this, but I also knew that I had to be patient. Eventually, we'd have to sit down and talk it out, but for now, I just needed to let things settle. I wasn't going to change my mind about her friend, but maybe I could find a better way to make her see where I was coming from. All I wanted was for us to be on the same page, but that seemed further away than ever. After a lot of back and forth, my wife finally came up with a compromise. She suggested that instead of getting a horse, she could just visit her friend's ranch whenever she wanted. It was her way of trying to meet me halfway, and I could tell she was trying to make things work between us. She said she could get her fill of horses and animals at the ranch without us having to deal with the responsibility of owning one. Honestly, I was relieved to hear it. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was definitely a step in the right direction. She even made a joke about it, saying, "Hey, at least this way you won't have to clean up after a horse." I couldn't help but crack a smile at that. She had a point. The idea of having to muck out a stable or figure out how to care for a horse was not something I was looking forward to. If her friend's ranch could give her what she wanted without turning our lives upside down, then maybe this could actually work. I agreed to the idea, and I could see a bit of the tension lift from her shoulders. It felt like, for once, we were on the same page. I knew this wasn't exactly what she wanted, but she seemed genuinely okay with the compromise. She told me that just being around the horses and riding once in a while would be enough for her. I could see the excitement in her eyes when she talked about it, and it made me feel a little better about the whole situation. At the end of the day, I wanted her to be happy, and if this was a way for her to get what she needed without adding more stress to our lives, then I was all for it. She started going to her friend's ranch a couple of times a week. It wasn't too far from where we lived, so it was convenient enough for her. She'd come back home after spending time there, telling me all about the horses she'd ridden and the things she'd learned. I could tell it brought her joy, and for a while, it felt like things were finally settling down. We weren't arguing as much, and she seemed happier overall. It was a nice change from the tension that had been hanging over us for the past few weeks. Of course, there was still a part of me that didn't fully trust the situation. Her friend's influence was still there, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another way for her friend to pull my wife into her world. But I kept those thoughts to myself. The last thing I wanted was to start another argument, especially when things seemed to be going well. If my wife was happy, then I was willing to let it be, at least for now. There were evenings when she'd come back from the ranch with a glow about her, a smile that hadn't been there in a while. She'd tell me about the horses she'd ridden, how one of them had a bit of an attitude, or how she'd helped her friend with some of the chores around the ranch. It was clear that being there gave her a sense of freedom that she didn't get from our day-to-day life. I could understand that, even if I didn't completely share her enthusiasm for it. I made a point to show interest when she talked about her time at the ranch. I asked her questions, listened to her stories, and tried to be supportive. I knew that this was important to her, and I didn't want her to feel like I was dismissing it. I may not have been thrilled about her friend's influence, but I loved my wife, and I wanted her to feel like I was in her corner. If going to the ranch made her happy, then I was willing to support her in that. Over time, the compromise started to feel like a good balance. She got to have her time with the horses, and I got the peace of knowing we weren't taking on more than we could handle. It wasn't perfect, but it worked for us. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were both getting what we needed. She had her outlet, her bit of adventure, and I had the stability I needed to keep our family on track. It wasn't exactly what either of us had envisioned, but it was enough. After my wife started going to the ranch more regularly, I began to notice some changes in her behavior. She started coming home later than usual, often well after dark. At first, I didn't think much of it. The ranch was a bit of a drive, and I figured maybe she was just losing track of time. But it kept happening. Every time she went out there, she seemed to come back later and later. And what was more, she was always in a great mood. Not just content or happy, she was practically glowing. It struck me as a little odd, to be honest. I know what physical activity is like. I've had my share of long days of work, and I know how tiring it can be. Working around horses, riding, helping with chores, all of that should wear a person out. But she didn't seem tired at all. She'd come through the door, her face flushed, with a smile that stretched from ear to ear. She'd be full of energy, talking a mile a minute about her day, about the horses, about whatever her friend had been up to. It was like she was getting more energy from being there, not less. I tried not to overthink it. I wanted to believe that she was just genuinely enjoying herself, that being out at the ranch was giving her something she needed. Maybe it was the fresh air, the change of scenery, the chance to do something different from our usual routine. I told myself that it was a good thing, that she deserved to have something that made her feel this happy. But there was still a part of me that couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the late nights or the energy she seemed to have. There was something else, something in the way she carried herself when she got back from the ranch. She seemed lighter, almost carefree, in a way that I hadn't seen in years. She'd come in, give me a quick kiss on the cheek, and then go off to take a shower or change clothes. It was like she was in her own little world, and I was just a part of the background. I tried not to let it bother me, but it was hard not to notice the difference. One evening, she came home even later than usual. I had already put the kids to bed, and I was sitting in the living room when she walked in. She was all smiles, as usual, and she seemed almost surprised to see me waiting up for her. She laughed it off, saying that time just got away from her again, but I couldn't help but feel a twinge of irritation. I asked her if everything was okay, and she gave me a strange look, like she didn't understand the question. She said everything was fine, that she'd just lost track of time while she was out riding. I nodded, but the feeling that something wasn't quite right lingered. I tried to ignore it, to brush it off as just my own overthinking. But the pattern continued. Every time she went to the ranch, she came back late, in a fantastic mood, and full of energy. It was like she was getting more out of those visits than just a chance to ride horses. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about the whole situation just didn't sit well with me. I wanted to believe that everything was fine, that she was just enjoying herself, but the nagging feeling in the back of my mind wouldn't go away. I started paying more attention, trying to pick up on anything that might explain the change in her behavior. I watched the way she talked about the ranch, the way she lit up whenever she mentioned her friend or the horses. It was like there was a whole other side of her life that I wasn't a part of, and it made me feel uneasy. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who doubted his wife, who questioned everything she did. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was different, and not necessarily in a good way. My suspicions about my wife had been gnawing at me for a while. The late nights, the energy she had when she got back from the ranch, none of it made sense to me. I tried to ignore it, to push the thoughts away, but it got to a point where I couldn't let it go. I had to know if there was something going on, something she wasn't telling me. So one night, after she came home and went straight to the shower, I decided to take a look in her bag. I knew it was wrong, that I was crossing a line, but the doubt had eaten away at me long enough. I found her bag in the corner of the bedroom, where she always left it. My heart was pounding as I unzipped it, part of me hoping that I wouldn't find anything, that I was just being paranoid. At first, it was just the usual stuff, some makeup, her wallet, a hairbrush. But then I found something that made me pause. There was a set of clothes neatly folded at the bottom of the bag. They were dry, and they looked like they hadn't been worn. It struck me as strange, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe she kept them there just in case, I thought. But then I saw something else that made my stomach drop. It was a small box, tucked away under the clothes. I pulled it out, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw what it was. Condoms. And not just any condoms, they were larger than any I'd ever seen. My mind went blank for a moment, and I felt a rush of emotions that I couldn't even begin to sort through. Anger, confusion, betrayal, they all hit me at once. I stood there, staring at the box, trying to make sense of it. There was no reason for her to have these. Not unless. I didn't want to finish that thought. I couldn't. I quickly shoved everything back into the bag, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do, what to think. My heart was racing, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Just as I was zipping the bag back up, I heard the bathroom door open. My wife stepped into the bedroom, and for a moment, I froze. She looked at me, and I tried to act natural, to pretend like nothing was wrong. She smiled, asking me what I was doing. I forced a smile back, saying I was just looking for my phone charger. She didn't seem to suspect anything, thankfully. She just nodded and went to the closet to grab some clothes. I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, trying to keep my expression neutral. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts all colliding at once. I watched her as she went about her routine, completely unaware of what I had just found. I felt a mix of emotions that I couldn't even begin to untangle. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand an explanation. But another part of me was scared of what she might say. I wasn't ready for that conversation, not yet. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything she was saying, couldn't bring myself to look her in the eye. She seemed oblivious, chatting away about her day at the ranch, about the horses and her friend. I nodded along, barely hearing her words. All I could think about was the box in her bag, the implications of what it meant. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like everything I thought I knew was suddenly uncertain. That night, I lay in bed next to her, staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. I could hear her breathing softly beside me, completely at ease, while my mind was spinning with questions. Why did she have those condoms? Who were they for? Was it possible that there was some innocent explanation, something I was missing? I wanted to believe that there was, but the doubt was too strong. I felt a knot in my chest, a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. That night, after everything that had happened, I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The weight of my suspicions was too much to bear, and eventually, I decided that I needed more than just guesses and doubts. I needed something concrete. I knew her phone was charging on the nightstand beside her. I hesitated for a long time, but finally, I made the decision. I needed to know the truth, even if it meant crossing a line I never thought I'd cross. I carefully reached over, trying not to wake her, and grabbed her phone. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. She always used the same passcode, so it wasn't hard. Once I was in, I started going through her messages. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, maybe nothing, maybe something innocent that would put my mind at ease. But deep down, I think I already knew what I was going to see. My heart sank as I opened her chat with her friend, the same friend who always seemed to be at the center of all this. The messages were right there, staring back at me. My wife had been complaining about me and the kids, telling her friend how tired she was of it all. She said she felt trapped, that she needed something more than just the same routine day in and day out. Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. I knew things hadn't been perfect between us, but I never imagined she felt this way. It was like I was reading the thoughts of a stranger, not the woman I'd been married to for years. I felt my stomach twist as I scrolled further. And then I saw it. She was talking about someone else, a man. She mentioned how exciting it had been, how it made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She talked about sneaking around, about how thrilling it was to have this secret. My chest tightened as I read her words, each one feeling like another blow. I could barely breathe, the betrayal hitting me all at once. She had been seeing someone else, and I had been completely oblivious. All the late nights, the changes in her behavior, it all made sense now. Her friend, ever the enabler, responded with encouragement. She told my wife that she deserved to be happy, that she should do whatever it took to keep that feeling alive. And then she suggested meeting up again on Saturday, at the ranch, just like they had done before. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as I read those words. They had used the ranch as their meeting place, right under my nose, while I had been at home taking care of our kids, trusting that she was just riding horses and spending time with her friend. I put the phone down, my hands trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked over at her, lying there peacefully, completely unaware that her secrets were out in the open. I felt a mix of emotions that I couldn't even begin to untangle, anger, hurt, disbelief. I wanted to wake her up, to confront her right then and there, to demand answers. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I needed time to process what I'd just seen, to figure out what my next move was going to be. The rest of the night, I sat in the living room, the glow of the streetlights coming through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. My mind was a mess, replaying everything I'd read, every word that had shattered the trust I'd had in her. I thought about our kids, about how this was going to affect them. I thought about the life we had built together, the years we had spent side by side, and how it all seemed to mean nothing to her now. I felt a deep sense of loss, as if the woman I loved had been replaced by someone I didn't recognize. By the time the sun started to rise, I still didn't have any answers. I knew I couldn't ignore what I'd found, but I also knew that I had to be smart about how I handled it. This wasn't just about me, it was about our family, our kids. I needed to confront her, but I needed to do it in a way that wouldn't destroy everything. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. One way or another, I was going to get to the bottom of this, but I had to be careful. The stakes were too high to let my emotions take over. The next morning, my wife came to me and said she needed to go visit her parents. She told me that her mother wasn't feeling well and could use some help around the house. She spoke with such conviction, her face calm, her voice steady, that for a moment, I almost believed her. But after everything I had seen the night before, I knew better. This wasn't about her mother. It was about something else, something she didn't want me to know about. I kept my expression neutral and nodded, agreeing that it made sense for her to go. I watched her as she moved around the kitchen, making herself a cup of coffee, acting like everything was perfectly normal. She was good at this, at pretending, at making it seem like there was nothing out of the ordinary. I could see now how easily I'd been fooled before, how she had managed to keep her secret from me for so long. It made me feel sick to think about it, but I had to keep my emotions in check. I couldn't let her know that I was onto her. Not yet. She went on about how her mother needed her, how it was important for her to be there. I nodded along, playing the part of the supportive husband. I told her to take as much time as she needed, that I'd handle everything at home while she was gone. She smiled, thanked me, and I could see a hint of relief in her eyes. She thought I was buying her story, that I was none the wiser. But I could see right through her now, and it was taking every ounce of self-control I had not to call her out on the spot. I asked her when she was planning to leave, and she said she'd go the next day. She wanted to get everything packed and ready, make sure she had what she needed for the trip. I nodded again, keeping my tone light, telling her that sounded like a good plan. Inside, though, I was already making my own plans. I knew where she was really going, or at least I had a pretty good idea. She wasn't going to her parents' house, she was going to meet him, the man she had been talking about with her friend. It was hard to look at her, knowing what I knew. I could still remember the messages, the way she had talked about feeling alive, about needing more than just the life we had. It hurt to see her standing there, lying to my face, pretending that everything was fine. But I couldn't let my anger show. I needed to stay calm, to wait for the right moment. If I confronted her now, she'd just deny it, make up some excuse, and I'd be left with nothing. No, I needed more than just suspicions. I needed proof. She spent the rest of the day getting ready, packing a small bag, making a list of things she needed to take. I watched her, trying to act like everything was normal, but it was difficult. Every smile she gave me, every casual comment, felt like a lie. I wanted to grab her, to shake her, to demand that she tell me the truth. But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. I had to be patient, to play along until I had what I needed to confront her once and for all. That evening, she called her parents, or at least she said she did. I could hear her in the other room, her voice warm and friendly, talking about how she'd be there soon, how she was looking forward to helping out. I wondered if she was really talking to them or if it was all just part of her act. I didn't ask, though. I just let her go on, pretending like I believed every word. It was hard, feeling like I was living in a lie, but I had to keep my focus on the bigger picture. When she finally went to bed, I stayed up for a while, thinking about what I was going to do. I knew that tomorrow, when she left, I'd have my chance. I could follow her, see where she was really going, find out the truth for myself. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I knew I had no choice. She had lied to me, betrayed me, and I needed to know just how deep it went. It was the only way I could figure out what to do next, the only way I could start to make sense of the mess our lives had become. As I finally lay down beside her, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had a plan now, a way to get the answers I needed. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew that whatever I found out might change everything, but I was ready for it. I had to be. There was no turning back now, not after everything that had happened. One way or another, I was going to find out the truth, and I was going to deal with it, whatever it took. On Saturday morning, my wife left for her so-called trip to her parents' house. She hugged me goodbye, gave me a quick smile, and assured me that she'd be back in a couple of days. I watched her drive away, my mind set on what I had to do next. I had already decided that I was going to verify her story, and there was no turning back now. As soon as she was out of sight, I grabbed my keys, got into my car, and headed towards her parents' place. I wanted to surprise them, just to see if she was really there like she said she would be. It was a long drive, and the entire time, my mind was racing. Part of me hoped that I was wrong, that I'd get there and find her sitting at the kitchen table with her mom, helping out just like she had said. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that everything she told me was a lie, and I needed to see it with my own eyes to finally accept it. The drive felt like it took forever, my heart pounding in my chest as I got closer to their house. When I pulled into their driveway, I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I walked up to the door and knocked, forcing a smile when her mother answered. She looked surprised to see me, but welcomed me in, asking if everything was all right. I glanced around the house, and it was immediately clear that my wife wasn't there. Her mother and father were both home, sitting in the living room, and there was no sign of my wife anywhere. I asked casually where she was, pretending like I was just trying to find her, and her mother looked confused. She said they hadn't seen her, that they didn't even know she was supposed to be coming. Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut, even though I had expected it. I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral, making up some excuse about a mix-up in plans. Her parents didn't seem to suspect anything, but I could tell they were a little puzzled by my visit. I made small talk for a few minutes, trying to act like everything was normal, but inside, I felt a mix of anger and disappointment that I could barely contain. I thanked them for their time and then told them I had to go, that I just wanted to stop by and say hello. As I was about to leave, her father asked if everything was okay between us. I paused for a moment, trying to decide how to respond. I forced another smile and nodded, telling him everything was fine, just a little misunderstanding. He seemed to accept it, but I could see the concern in his eyes. I said my goodbyes and headed back to my car, my hands shaking as I got in and started the engine. I had known she was lying, but actually hearing it from her parents made it real in a way that I hadn't been prepared for. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to collect myself, trying to figure out what to do next. There was only one place she could be, the ranch. The messages I had read on her phone had made that clear. She was meeting him there, and I knew I couldn't just go home and pretend like nothing was happening. I had to see it for myself, even if it meant facing the worst. I took a deep breath, started the car, and headed towards the ranch, my heart pounding harder with every mile. The drive felt like a blur, my mind focused on what I might find when I got there. I tried to prepare myself for it, to steel myself against the possibility of seeing her with him. But no matter how much I tried, I knew that nothing could really prepare me for what was coming. I had never imagined that our life would come to this, that I'd be driving out to catch my wife in a lie, to see her with someone else. It felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's nightmare. When I finally pulled up to the ranch, I parked a little way off, not wanting to be seen right away. I could see the stables in the distance, the horses grazing in the field, everything looking peaceful and quiet. But I knew that beneath that calm surface, there was something much darker going on. I took another deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. I had come this far, and there was no turning back now. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. When I arrived at the ranch, I parked at a distance, keeping out of sight. My heart was pounding, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I tried to gather myself. I had no idea what I was about to see, but I knew I needed to be prepared for anything. I stepped out of the car, moving cautiously, staying close to the trees as I made my way towards the stables. The closer I got, the more I could hear, laughter, voices, and the unmistakable sound of horses moving in their stalls. I kept going, my eyes scanning for any sign of her. As I reached the edge of the stables, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There, in one of the open pens, was my wife. She was completely exposed, lying next to an animal, lost in her own world, with no regard for anything else around her. The scene was shocking, not just because of what she was doing, but because of how utterly different she seemed. She wasn't the woman I knew, not the mother of my children, not the person I had built a life with. She was someone else entirely, someone I didn't recognize at all. I stood there, frozen, watching in disbelief. There was a man nearby, someone I didn't recognize, watching her with a smirk on his face. I felt a rush of anger so strong that I almost stepped forward, almost shouted out right then and there. But something stopped me. Instead, I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking as I opened the camera. I knew I needed proof. Proof of what she had done, proof of who she had become. I hit record, my heart pounding in my ears as I captured the scene in front of me. It felt surreal, like I was watching a nightmare unfold in real time. I couldn't believe that this was my life, that this was what it had come to. I watched through the screen of my phone, feeling a mix of rage, disgust, and sadness that I couldn't even begin to process. I didn't want to be here, didn't want to see any of this, but I knew that I had to. I needed to know the truth, and now that I had it, I knew there was no going back. After what felt like an eternity, I finally lowered my phone, ending the recording. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I knew what I had to do next, even though it made my stomach turn. I needed her parents to see this, to understand what she had done. They had always been supportive of her, always believed in her, and I needed them to see the truth, to understand why things were about to change. I sent the video to them, my hands trembling as I hit send, knowing that this was going to shatter everything. I turned and walked away, my mind numb, my heart heavy. I didn't look back, didn't want to see any more. I made my way back to the car, feeling like I was moving through a fog. Everything felt unreal, like I was disconnected from my own body. I got in, started the engine, and drove away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't know where I was going, didn't have a plan beyond getting away from that place, from what I had just witnessed. As I drove, my phone buzzed with messages from her parents. I didn't look at them, couldn't bring myself to see their reactions. I knew they were going to be devastated, that this was going to destroy them just as much as it was destroying me. But they needed to know. They needed to see what she had become, what she had done to our family. There was no hiding from it now, no pretending that everything was okay. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back. By the time I finally pulled over, I felt completely drained. I sat there, staring out at the empty road ahead, trying to figure out what to do next. My life had just been turned upside down, everything I thought I knew had been shattered. I knew that I needed to confront her, to end this once and for all. But for now, all I could do was sit there, trying to catch my breath, trying to come to terms with what I had just seen. The reaction from her parents was immediate and devastating. After receiving the video, they called me, their voices shaking with disbelief and anger. They couldn't comprehend what their daughter had done, couldn't understand how she had ended up in such a situation. They were heartbroken, and I could hear the pain in their voices as they tried to make sense of it all. Her mother was crying, her father was furious, and neither of them had any answers. They asked me if it was real, if there was some kind of mistake, but I had no comforting words to offer them. What they saw was the harsh reality. When they finally came to terms with what had happened, they made a decision that I knew must have been incredibly difficult for them. They told me that they were cutting her off, that they couldn't support her after what she had done. They were in shock, but they were also resolute. They said they were disowning her, removing her from their will, and that they didn't want anything more to do with her. It was a harsh reaction, but given what she had done, I understood their decision. It was clear that they felt as betrayed as I did. After speaking with them, I felt a strange sense of finality. It was like a door had closed, and there was no going back. I knew what I had to do next, and as painful as it was, I knew it was the right thing for me and for the kids. I filed for divorce that same week. There was no point in trying to salvage what was left of our marriage, there was nothing left to save. The betrayal had cut too deep, and there was no coming back from it. I needed to protect my children and myself, and that meant ending things once and for all. The legal process was grueling, but I was determined to see it through. I fought for custody of the kids, and thankfully, the evidence I had made it clear that they were better off with me. The judge awarded me full custody, and I was able to keep the house and most of our assets. It wasn't about revenge, it was about making sure my children had a stable home, a place where they could feel safe. My wife, or rather my ex-wife, had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. After the divorce was finalized, she moved in with her friend, the same friend who had encouraged her reckless behavior, who had been there every step of the way. I didn't care what she did or where she went, as long as she stayed away from me and the kids. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. It was painful to think about the woman I had once loved, the mother of my children, reduced to this. But I couldn't dwell on it. I had to focus on what mattered now, my children and their future. Her parents, despite their own pain, stepped in to help me with the kids. They were devastated by what had happened, but they wanted to be there for their grandchildren. They offered to help in any way they could, and I was grateful for their support. It wasn't easy for them, but they made it clear that their love for the kids hadn't changed, and they wanted to be a part of their lives. It was a small comfort in the midst of all the chaos, knowing that I wasn't alone in this. The transition was difficult, especially for the kids. They didn't understand why their mother wasn't around anymore, why everything had changed so suddenly. I tried my best to explain it to them in a way that made sense, without burdening them with the full truth. They were too young to understand the details, and I didn't want them to carry the weight of what had happened. I just told them that their mother needed time, that she wasn't able to be with us right now. It was the hardest part of all of this, seeing the confusion and sadness in their eyes, knowing that they had lost something they couldn't fully comprehend. As the weeks turned into months, we slowly began to find a new rhythm. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all felt almost unbearable. But we kept moving forward, one day at a time. I focused on my work, on taking care of the kids, on rebuilding the life that had been torn apart. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the one I had now, and I was determined to make the best of it. With the help of her parents, and the support of a few close friends, we began to find our way again, to create a new sense of normalcy. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be more challenges to face, more questions from the kids, more moments of doubt and pain. But I also knew that we were stronger than this, that we could get through it together. The betrayal had broken our family, but it hadn't destroyed us. We were still here, still standing, and that was enough for me to keep going. One day at a time, we would rebuild, and we would find happiness again.